Kerouac. Yeah. Kerouac. His words. The words. So many words, just all brothers of the same horn, sisters of the saxophone.
The subject for tonight's discussion is there a beat generation? It is a subject of considerable interest on many college campuses, particularly urban universities. It is of literary interest, of interest as a social phenomenon, and some would consider as a symptom of the alienation which many young people experience in trying to adapt to the standards of the problems of our society in this anxious age. Our first speaker is a man who has been called the spokesman of the Beat Generation, although it is my understanding that he dislikes this title. He is a native of Lowell, Massachusetts, a former student at Columbia University, author of numerous articles and books, including The Town and the City, On the Road, Subterraneans, and most recently, The Dharma Bums. I am pleased to present Mr. Jack Kerouac.
With Kerouac, he was a mix of good and evil. I think that's why we identify much more with him, because he's not a phony. He tells us right up front.
He like Allen Ginsberg, they were in a sense ahead of their time. They expressed the kind of restlessness and longings that a lot of people felt but had not yet been able to articulate. And they said it very powerfully, and people heard the message and responded in kind of an overwhelming way. He was a marvelously charismatic person, who told wonderful stories and had a real sort of sweetness and openness about him when he was at his best, and a real energy. It was very appealing.
They represented people who were talking about their soul and about other things that men were not supposed to talk about. And they were talking about it out loud, and they were talking about it as a means against an authoritarian situation that was existing, that in fact is still existing.
The kinds of forms he worked with were explosive. I mean, there was so much energy that could not be contained in a simple format. So I think, it's important to look at the shape of the writing, and then the sense of, the music of his imagination, and the way he was able to take his own very complicated mind grammar and translate that into a living text. It's quite unique.
All he wanted to do was write, really, and he didn't really want to be the spokesman of a generation. He didn't want to have a lot of imitators and followers. That was much more Ginsberg's kind of thing.
He didn't deal with fame, it seemed to deal with him. Ginsberg dealt with fame.
I'd rather be thin than famous. I don't want to be fat. And a woman throws me out of bed calling me Gordo. And every time I bend to pick up my suspenders from the Davenport floor, I explode loud, huge grunto and disgust everyone in the familio. I'd rather be thin than famous, but I'm fat. Paste that in your Broadway show.
Usually when you erect a monument to someone, you have a representation of his face or a bust or something like that with his name and his dates. We did something different. You walk into the monument to Jack, and you're surrounded by his words. He loved this city. He wrote a lot of books about it, where the whole setting for the entire books are right here. Visions of Gerard, Dr. Sachs, Maggie Cassidy. Those are the three very important ones that are set firmly right here in Lowell.
We're going to have walking tours and bus tours and a small press fair. Ann Waldman is going to be at the Smith Baker Center on Saturday. I'm not expecting you to memorize all this. We'll have schedules everywhere throughout the city. So thanks for coming and enjoy the festival. Have a great weekend.
Lowell Celebrates Kerouac is our goal is to celebrate Jack Kerouac's art. He was a wonderful writer with lots of energy. We always have several guided tours of the city and of Kerouac sites because so much of the city hasn't changed. So much is the same as Jack wrote about. You can still take his books and walk through the city.
These schools in Lowell, Mass. were called Saint-Louis de France and St. Joseph. When I got to public schools in college, I was already so advanced, I set new records cutting classes in order to go to the library and read all day, or to stay in my room at college and write plays.
When I was a very young boy, 6 or 7 years old, in my home, I had a brother, Sebastian, who was a close friend of Jack's. And at that time, they were probably the ages of 14, 15, 16, 17. And there was a group of these young boys, teenagers, who used to gather in the front room of my home. And they would sit around there and have coffee and exchange ideas about literature, about Spengler, about the Brotherhood of Man, about Walt Whitman. And then Jack went off to college. My brother went off to college. And I didn't see Jack again till about 1964, when he came back to Lowell. He would wind up in Nicky's bar. He'd look up my brother who owned Nicky's bar, who's dead now. And he'd visit Stella. He'd visit his old friends here in Lowell, and he'd go back to Long Island where he was living at that time. Then I got to know Jack especially well after 1966, when he married my sister Stella.
His widow once said, Stella, if you want to know Jack, come to Lowell or read his books. That's the only way you know. Because he's such an intense, personal writer. He wants you to look at the world or experience through him. He's like a funnel. And a lot of the things that he says, because of his honesty, we tend to say, well, yeah, that's the way I look at it too.
Lowell is still a very conservative industrial town with a very strong working class, and a lot of people don't understand On the Road, and they don't understand Greenwich Village, and they don't understand San Francisco.
It's a mill town, you know. It's working class people that live here, you know. Lowell is a true American city because there's so much mix of culture, you know. So many different nationalities that come here and blend so well.
Praised be man. He is existing in milk and living in lilies, and his violin music takes place in milk and creamy emptiness. Praised be the unfolded inside petal flesh of tenderest thought. Petrels on the follying wave valleys idly sing themselves asleep. Praised be delusion, the ripple. Praised be the holy ocean of eternity. Praised be I, writing, dead already and dead again, dipped in Ancid Inkle, the flammed of Tim, the Anglo-Oglo-Saxon maneuvers of old poetos. Praised be wood, it is milk. Praised be honey at the source. Praised be the embrace of soft sleep, the valor of angels in valleys of hell on earth below. Praised be the non-ending. Praised be the lights of Earthman. Praised be the watchers. Praised be my fellow man for dwelling in milk.
Now, among the population, if you walk around, you go to the bars, you go to the restaurants, and you tell people over here that you're here to all the way from Denmark for Kerouac, they'll probably tell you, well, he was a bum. Oh yeah, we know he was a writer, but he was a bum.
Do you think that Jack Kerouac, did he buy any clothes there?
Well, I probably wouldn't think of him because he was always drunk, and who knows what Jack Kerouac. Those years, nobody cared. That's 1935. This is my first dollar. Now he's just starting to become big. That's me when I first came. But you see a lot of drunks. I lived in back Central Street, and there were all barrooms there. And you're so used to seeing people in the gutters that just like you see people coming in the store. So maybe I know him, maybe I saw him, but didn't pay attention. This is the Holocaust.
Oh, yeah.
At that time, nobody did. Nobody know Jack Kerouac, that he's a big shot.
1-800-934-2221. We're going to be right back after these messages.
I'm going to think about it. Okay?
By 1957, when Alan arranges for me to meet Jack Kerouac on a blind date, I'd gone through a break with my family, a devastating love affair, and an illegal abortion. I never asked Alan exactly why he decided to bring Jack and me together. I think it was a characteristic mixture of kindliness and practicality and erotic mischief. Alan was always taking care of people, looking out for his friends. Jack was lonely, homeless as usual, and dead broke. I was lonely too, and I had an apartment.
I met Jack in January of 1957, which was 9 months before the publication of On the Road. At the time, I was 21 years old, and I was working as a secretary in a literary agency. And I had heard of Jack before I met him because my best friend Elise Cowan, whom I'd gone to Barnard College with, had become very involved with Allen Ginsberg. So one night I was over at Elise's apartment and the phone rang, and it was Jack. And he said, hi, I'm Jack Kerouac. Would you like to, Alan said, you're very nice. Would you like to meet me? I'll be at Howard Johnson's, which was a luncheonette in the West Village. So I went down there, and there he was, sort of sitting at the counter. He was down to his last $5. And I actually bought him dinner that night, hot dogs and baked beans, and we ended up going up to my apartment, which was around Columbia University, and that was the beginning of our relationship.
The goofy, foolish, human parade passing on Sunday art streets of Greenwich Village. Pitiful drawings of images on an iron fence ranged there by self-believing artists with no hair and black berets, showing green seas eating at rock and Pleiades of time, pestiferating at moon squid, salt flat tip fly toad tat sand traps, with cigar-smoking interests puffing at the stroll.
New York in the middle 50s, and when I was in high school, there were all these people around Auden and Jacques Maritain and Genet and Burroughs and Ginsberg and this one and Kerouac and James Baldwin. They were all sort of wandering through New York all the time. And New York was a very fluid, open scene. There were jazz bars on the Bowery. So there was a real mixing, and young people, myself included, were involved in. I was very impressed by the accomplishment of people like James Baldwin. I was very impressed by the accomplishment of people like Kerouac. There was a place called the Kettle of Fish. There was a bar called the Cedar Bar. But it was another bar that you could dance in. It had a piano player, and a lot of people drank there as well. And you drank a lot. It was a heavy drinking time. And New York was a night city. Nobody was working. Nobody had to get up and go to work. So you were out in the clubs all night. You were out in the bars all night. And you were talking. It was an enormous gab fest that went on from the 50s through the 60s, just until the 70s when it became Europeanized again. And the gab fest stopped and people started having dinner.
Cooper Union Blues. The muzak is too sod. The gaiety of grave candidates makes my gut weep, and my brains are awash down the side of the blue-orange table. As little sneery, snurfling Puerto Rican hero bats by booming his coat pocket, fisting to the vicinity where mortuary waits for bait. What kind of service do broken garrels give? Oh, have pity, bodhisattva of intellectual radiance. Save the world from her eyebrows of beautiful illusion. Hope, oh hope, oh nope, oh pope.
The normal, regular reviewer for the New York Times, Orville Prescott, who was a very conservative man, was away on Labor Day vacation. So it fell to Gilbert Milstein to review on the road. And Gilbert Milstein had already been following the beats, so he had, and he wrote the kind of review that established Jack overnight as a very, very important voice. And from then on, all hell broke loose.
Now it's jazz. The place is roaring. All beautiful girls in there. One mad brunette at the bar, drunk with her boys. One strange chick I remember from somewhere wearing a simple skirt with pockets, her hands in there. Short haircut, slouched, talking to everybody. Up and down the stairs they come. The bartenders are the regular band of Jack and the heavenly drummer who looks up in the sky with blue eyes, with a beard. He's wailing beer caps of bottles and jamming at the cash register, and everything is going to the beat. It's the beat generation. It's Bayat. It's the beat to keep. It's the beat of the heart. It's being beat and down in the world, and like old-time lowdown. And like in ancient civilizations, the slave boatmen rowing galleys to a beat, and servants spinning pottery to a beat. The faces.
My wife, who was the Russian princess, Zina, said, look, you've met some of the beats, but you haven't met the main man. I said, well, what do you mean? Well, he's the guy that started all this revolution, and he wrote this novel, On the Road. She said, you really should meet him, and particularly because you love jazz so much. And she knew that I was hanging out in the jazz clubs all the time. And that's how Kerouac came up with this way of working. He would listen to saxophone players playing riffs like Coltrane, and from that he got the sort of lyric quality he wanted to his writing. And so he would listen to jazz, let's say on the jukebox, and there'd be some theme, and then he would try and say a poem behind this. And so that afternoon he was experimenting with this various stuff, and of course I loved it as a technique. I mean, he would recite something in a certain accent, and I would do another accent and recite something else, and we'd improvise like that. But of course we're drinking all the time, and eventually we got so whacked out that we couldn't make sense. So, by the time she came to pick us up, we were literally on the floor together.
He definitely wanted his work published by that point. He was desperate to have it published. He'd been totally frustrated and worn down by the fact that he couldn't get published.
I think the saddest thing about Jack was he wasn't very prolific after a certain point. But he did a lot of work that now they have subsequently found and published. Notes and drafts and projects that he was working on. These have all finally come to light, and they have sustained the Kerouac myth. If you look at it, the Kerouac estate was worth $95 when he died, and today it's worth $10 million.
What I get out of the notebooks is that Jack did want recognition. And he struggled very hard between 1951 and 1957, writing many books that were submitted to publishers and never did get published, till after On the Road got published. And he got this instant recognition. And then the following 5 or 6 weeks, he was a whirl of parties, social events, phone calls, the press. And I think he handled it, but at the time he handled it very well, but then he withdrew from it. Because I think basically Jack was a recluse, and the reason he was a recluse was because he wanted to do his work.
Guys with big pockets and heavy top coats and slit scar, head bands down the middle of their hair, all Bruce Barton combed, stand surveying Harrison, Folsom and the ramp, and the red brick clock. Wishing they had a woman with some money, honey.
My own feelings about Jack are that if he had had a sort of more normal kind of literary success, say some, wonderful sort of, very nice critical reviews praising his style, but if he hadn't also sort of become a culture hero, he could have survived the whole experience, perhaps. Although by 1957, he was actually quite far gone. He'd been on a kind of downward trajectory. I think since my own feeling is that it sort of started around 1951, around the time that he wrote On the Road and sort of broke through into this new way of writing.
He did it on speed and alcohol. The speed to get going and get into it, deep into it, and stay up day and night until you got it. And the alcohol to try and get off the effect, the terrible depression that comes when the speed wears off.
It somehow destabilized him, and he became very depressed, rather paranoid. You can sort of see it in his letters, and began, taking more drugs, drinking more heavily. So there was a kind of deterioration going on.
My father met Jack Kerouac about 3 or 4 years before Jack died, and had grown up in the same area of town as Jack in Centerville, which is part of Lowell, part of the town, and they went to the same schools. They had the same upbringing, Roman Catholic, French Canadian, but they were 2 years apart in school, so they never met up with each other all in that course of their life. But later in life, a man named Tony Sampas, who owned Nicky's bar room in Lowell, where Jack hung around, introduced my father to Jack, and they immediately hit it off. He said, "I'm always glad to buy a starving artist a drink, starving author a drink." And from then they became best friends. Jack was always, once he get greased up a little, he was kind of boisterous, and occasionally, Jack would, get a little overzealous and stuff, and they'd have to move along to another bar, so they'd say, he's all right. My father would always, smooth things over with the bartenders, and he'd say, he's all right. He's harmless. He's just, spouting steam. And the bartender would say, "I don't give a shit what he is. He's getting out of here.
At the end of his life, Jack said that he was so tired that he wished he could just retire, build a cabin house on top of Christian Hill to contemplate his beloved Lowell. That's unusual to refer to your hometown, especially a mill town, as your beloved Lowell. Well, he did.
Old age is an Indian with gray hair and a cane in an old coat, tapping along the rainy street to see the pretty oranges and the stores on his big day when the dogs let out.
64, 65, 66, 67, he was still writing Vanity of Toulouse and Satori in Paris. And he was still working on another book called Memory Babe, which was never completed. He would spend most of his time at home working. For example, he'd probably go to bed at 4 or 5 in the morning and sleep till late afternoon. And then he'd hang around the house with his mother and Stella. They'd have dinner and they'd watch TV and people would pop in on them. And either he stayed home that night or he went out looking for friends to have a drink with.
He was not someone who was ready to take on, the commitment of being a husband and a father. He had been married. He'd been married twice, and his second wife had had a child by him. And he refused to admit that he was really the father of that little girl who looked exactly like him.
I keep falling in love with my mother. I don't want to hurt her. Of all people to hurt. Every time I see her, she's grown older. But her uniform always amazes me for its Dutch simplicity and the doll she is. The doll-like way she stands, bow-legged in my dreams, waiting to serve me. And I am only an Apache, smoking hashi in old Kabashi by the lamp.
I think a lot of his trouble stemmed from his relationship with his mother, which was much too close. The roots of that were in his early childhood when his older brother Gerard died of rheumatic fever. And that sort of started a tremendously intense relationship between Jack and his mother. And his mother was she was a woman who had worked in factories, and she was the age of 14. She didn't know about Freud. She didn't know that this would be bad for Jack. And so he was much too bound to her to really have room in his life for another woman.
No one in my family could ever realize that this was an important movement that was going on and that it was going to mean something culturally. That's something they still don't grasp. They have no idea. That's what I have to live with. I mean, you can't change your family. And I think Kerouac suffered the same problem. I think every artist who finally does achieve some sort of standing becomes divorced from his old friends and his family as a result, because they can never see him in that light.
So in order to gear himself up to deal with the demands of his fame, he would, do a tremendous amount of drinking, and he'd go on TV shows drunk and so on. But he was really one of the first writers to get that full celebrity treatment. For one thing, TV was quite new, and the talk show had just been invented, and he was one of the first writers to go on be interviewed on TV, on talk shows, and so on. I mean, it was nothing he could possibly have been ready for.
He had a shapely mind, Kerouac, and he worked on, shaping, and yet it's all coming up out of this, this sort wellspring of, phenomenal attention, sensory, his sensory awareness, his awareness of the subtleties, which is why I think he had to, drink. I mean, to deaden that, he was so hyper sensitive.
You have to remember there is something to be said about alcoholism for writers. They have a tendency to maybe be able to continue to write, like Faulkner and all, but the strain of being a person and being a writer, since being a writer is not being a person. You suspend your life every time a writer writes. And I noticed that when I'd look at these people. They would live this hard, screaming, yelling life. And then there would be some time they'd have to write something, and every one of them to a person, male, female, heterosexual, homosexual, didn't make any difference. They'd all have to go and suspend their life.
Women with red banjos on their handbags, and art's handicrafty, slow shuffling ardors of Washington Square, passing in what they think is a happy June afternoon. Good God, the sorrow! They don't even listen to me when I try to tell them they will die. They say, of course I know I'll die. Why should you mention it now? Why should I worry about it? It'll happen now. I want a good time. Excuse me, it's a beautiful, happy June afternoon. I want to walk in.
No trip ever turned out well for Jack. He always, sooner or later, said there were bad vibes here. You know, this isn't what I expected, and he'd move on.
Jack, in his notebooks, some of his notebooks, as late as early as 66, 67, he was always had his notebooks, and he would write in it sometimes things like, I can't write these notebooks anymore. And by that he meant that he wasn't able to concentrate on his thoughts and jot these things down.
My own theory is that before he started writing in this new way, in this spontaneous bop prosody, that he had worked, in a more conventional way, because he'd written his first novel, Town and the City, over many years, and it had always sort of been at the center of his life, and I think it sort of stabilized him. But now there would be these tremendous spurts of creative activity, these short periods where he would produce a book, and in between there would be these sort of terrible valleys where he'd be very depressed and sort of wandering around the country and essentially homeless and embittered.
I can see the blank wall. I can see the silhouette in the window. He's talking. I'm not interested in what he's talking about. I'm only interested in the fact that it's the last hotel. The last hotel. Ghosts in my bed. Goats are bled. The last hotel.
Ginsberg once said, well, who wants to grow up? Who wants to be a kid? Let's stay in childhood. It's more comfortable. It's not as demanding. But true, Kerouac, his only responsibility was to be a writer. As he says in the introduction to Lonesome Traveler, I always considered writing my duty on earth. And that was it.